pro-Russian voices are pretty loud in South/Eastern Europe in general. So much so that there are governments in power, for example in Slovakia and Hungary, which are de facto pro-Russian. Now you might be wondering, why the fuck is that? Haven't they learned about history? Or what? Well, there is a very short answer. Yeah, and the long answer is a bit more complicated. A lot more complicated, I should say. If we go back to the 80s and look at the countries in the Warsaw Pact, we can feel a sense of optimism. As the Soviet Union's power deteriorated and dictatorships in the region became less totalitarian, we could clearly see a natural cultural lean towards the West in these countries. Western farmer jeans and coats, acquired via smuggling, became the fashion, and if you had one, you could feel on top of the world. After decades of oppression, being unable to even leave your country towards the West due to the Iron Curtain, the ever-growing desire to have just a glimpse of Western freedom was inside every heart. Hell, during the turbulent times of political transition to democracy, we were promised that in this new coming world, we would be able to open our own cafes in Western cities, which would be owned by us, not by our government, as it has traditionally been. This was obviously a far-fetched idea for most people in Eastern Europe having no capital whatsoever, nor the culture of entrepreneurship, but we believed, perhaps because we wanted to believe. After the regime changes, things went relatively okay-ish in general in the region, but a clear divide in Eastern European societies, which perhaps was always there, started to appear. Now, this is not unique, we can see it everywhere in Western civilization, which includes Eastern Europe, of course. It's a general trend that people living in more advanced environments, like a big city, develop a different kind of mindset to those who live in less advanced areas, where everybody knows everyone, blah blah blah. But the left in most Eastern European countries are actually more to the right than the right itself of Western European countries. For example, the right-wing party of Poland is heavily against abortion, while the so-called left are basically classical liberals from 30 years ago, and they would allow it. The right is heavily against LGBTQ stuff, while the left is simply not bothered, and it doesn't go batshit crazy over any criticism of it. There is a consensus, though, that immigration is bad. We can see similar patterns in Hungary, where the right now wants to ban pride, and the left basically does not touch the topic, and basically agree that where the Westerners have gone with these issues is way too far. Essentially, the right in Eastern Europe is kind of authoritarian, and the left just wants to become what their idea of the West is from 30 years ago. Now obviously I've not gone into details on this one, but you get the main point. We are so much more right-wing in general. This is due to a variety of infinitely complex reasons, which I don't think anyone on Earth truly or fully understands. And I don't want to go into detail about it right now, the point is obvious. So, there is an inherent element of admiring the West, or rather what it used to be, in being a so-called leftist in Eastern Europe. Sometimes, even, kind of in a mindless way, whatever the West is, we truly want to become like that. Now that has obviously never worked, because in wishing so hard to become a true Westerner, the Easterner to some extent tends to replace his true identity, everything he socialized in, everything he has experienced in the past, with what he perceives to be the West. But you can't actually know what it is like to be a Westerner unless you're one. So the narrative is usually just to agree and go along with whatever they say, mindlessly driven by some kind of inferiority complex. And by now, that has massively backfired. The values that we used to admire so hard seem to have evaporated. Liberalism has turned into a parody of itself, and I think it's obvious. Men in women's sports, the madness and the virtue signaling around environmental issues, 72 genders, importing millions of illegal immigrants with totally incompatible cultures and no willing to assimilate, supporting literal terrorists, and I could go on forever. None of these issues can be argued for rationally, and honestly, I've never seen a single person arguing for it in a good faith way, without obvious lies, and without calling everyone a bigot, everything phobe, everythingist. And the way these topics are approached, the intention of silencing everyone who disagrees, cancelling everyone who doesn't use the new made-up terminologies, or cancelling them for disagreeing about anything you say. Well, to say the least, this really reminds of a kind of totalitarianism which we've suffered under decades after World War II. And the critical part of this issue is that the far left, including the so-called conservatives in many countries like Britain and Germany, resembles every attribute of toxic femininity. All the gaslighting, the name-calling, the virtue signaling, destroying of reputation, these are typical traits you see in a very toxic woman. And so, as Eastern Europeans, we are not infected by this woke mind virus. We can look at what's happening in Eastern Europe from a sane perspective, and we see that what's happening is objectively horrible. The voices advocating so hardly that we should become a true part of the West are now going ever more quiet, because even the so-called left of Eastern Europe is realizing what's happening. Their arguments have shattered, their hand is empty. As this position is disappearing, many Eastern Europeans who have hoped for decades that one day maybe they can become a society like the UK or Germany feel betrayed. This betrayal breeds anger. Anger towards not just the West, not just against wokeness, but against classical liberal values, because the perception is that they either inevitably lead to this, or it enables wokeness to manifest and overtake. And the toxic feminine, manipulative nature of wokeness, in work for 10 plus years now, has made it that the average person can't even differentiate between classical liberal values and this perverted garbage. The right-wingers are in a state of absolute revolution now. Their hatred towards the left is so hard that if a leftist says anything about the topic, the right will automatically say the opposite. And I swear to God, each time people like Keir Starmer opens his mouth and starts talking about Ukraine, people shift towards the Russians. And hell, this is not even just in Eastern Europe. A while ago, Trump humiliated Zelensky in such a way never seen for like 80 years in diplomacy. And the MAGA fans were cheering. Thing is, the right, especially in Eastern Europe, simply views Putinism as a better alternative, as something masculine, a society that values strength, nationalism, commitment, as a traditional society, perhaps as something we can just go back into, but definitely as something at least respectable. This is in great contrast with the left, whose values and actions are totally suicidal. Now obviously this sounds kind of stupid. Russia is a de facto dictatorship, divorce rates are at the skies, alcoholism the highest in the world, you can't trust the judiciary system, but a right-winger can still argue that he'd rather have their grandchildren grow up in Russian-like society than in a left-dominated Western one, because in 10 plus years, Russia will absolutely be standing in some form, while the West might become a fucking caliphate, if current trends continue. So yeah, that's where we're standing right now. As a Hungarian, I'm so grateful for you, and you, and you, and you, and everyone that bent the knee for them, for driving tens of percentages of the right-wingers in Eastern Europe, and frankly Western Europe also, that now they sympathize with the Russians over the Ukrainians, who have in 1848 crushed our rebellion for national freedom and civil reforms, which could have made it so that later we don't join World War I as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, we don't lose 2/3 of our territory. They sympathize with the Russians who occupied our country after World War II, and in 1956 drown our rebellion against their communist terror regime in blood. Maybe, had they not have done that, we would already be a free, flourishing, equitable society that Western Europe once represented, and which seems to be fading into oblivion. Anyways, if you'd like to cheer me up, please like and subscribe. It's really just 2 buttons and it helps me out a lot. Thank you very much for watching.